Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first event in the 2024 Experience Columbia Summer Program. Our summer public program provides an opportunity to connect with Columbia's celebrated faculty and explore their work and impact, focused on topics of our summer focus areas. It is not by accident that we host tonight's special event on World Environment Day. Tonight's event, Public Affairs and Sustainable Futures, is moderated by Dr. Steve Cohen. Dr. Cohen is the Senior Vice Dean of the School of Professional Studies here at Columbia University. He is also a professor in the practice of public affairs at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. Also at CEPA, he serves as the director of the Master of Public Administration in Environmental Science and Policy program, as well as the director of the Executive MPA concentration in Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management. He is also the director of the Master of Science in Sustainability Management program at Columbia's School of Professional Studies. Finally, he is the director of the research program on sustainability policy and management at Columbia's Earth Institute. If anyone can lay claim to having helped shape sustainable futures, it is Steve Cohen. Throughout his career, he has held and continues to hold various academic and leadership positions here at the university. He served as the executive director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University from 1995 to 2001, where he played a key role in developing interdisciplinary approaches to addressing global sustainability issues. He has been a professor at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs since 1982 and has served as the Senior Vice Dean of the School of Professional Studies since 2018. His research focuses on environmental policy, sustainable development, and the intersection of government, business, and civil society in addressing environmental challenges. He has authored a number of publications, including books, articles, and reports that have influenced policy debates and decision-making at local, national, and international levels. This evening, he is joined by Curtis Probst, the CEO of New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation, and a lecturer in professional studies in the Sustainability Management program. Susanne DesRoches, the Vice President of Clean and Resilient Buildings at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, and a lecturer in professional studies in the Sustainability Management program. And finally, Adam Freed, a principal at Bloomberg Associates and a lecturer in professional studies in the Sustainability Management program, and with the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Please join me in welcoming our speakers. Dr. Cohen, over to you.
Thanks, Eric. And I should mention that all three of our panelists teach in the Sustainability Management program, and the first two over here are graduates of CEPA's Environmental Science and Policy program, and all three are major contributors to the world of sustainability management and policy in this region, which you'll be learning about in a little while. I just want to start with a little bit of an introduction to the subject tonight. And it's really about the critical role that government plays in the transition to an environmentally sustainable economy, and also the partnership that's so essential with the private sector. But government plays a key role, and we're holding this panel tonight on a somewhat sad night because the governor of New York just decided to tank congestion pricing. And so back in the 1950s, John Kennedy wrote a book called Profiles in Courage, which is about senators who gave up their careers to do something courageous in politics. This is a profile in cowardice, which is underway right now to try to somehow curry election favor during an election year, giving up on one of the most important policy initiatives that was going to happen at the end of June, and hopefully at some point it'll come back to us. But one of the things that I've been working on and learning really over the last decade is how important the private sector is to this transition. And it's not just that government has to regulate the private sector to do the right thing. It's really that the private sector is going to be one of the main movers as we decarbonize our economy and as we build the circular economy that we have to have here. there are a lot of pieces of this puzzle, and actually the speakers here today, our panelists, represent different pieces of this. Curtis' role in New York City's Green Bank is to try to help finance the parts of the private sector that can't get financed in the normal way, but could in fact become highly profitable. The work that Susanne's doing in NYSERDA is focused on the built environment and making that built environment more energy efficient. And in addition to teaching our sustainability metrics course, Adam has been all over the world with Bloomberg's pro bono consulting business, helping all cities learn the lessons that we've learned here, and also teaching each other the innovative practices that we need for government and the private sector to work together to bring about this renewable economy. Now, I'm an optimist. I actually think this is going to happen. It'll happen no matter who's running the country or the state of New York or even the city of New York. We will figure out ways of doing this. As I often say, the human species is ingenious and we're not suicidal. So we are going to figure this out. It will never be a smooth process. It's always going to be 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But I've actually been involved in the world of environmental protection since the mid-1970s. I worked at EPA when it was 7 years old. I worked in the water program and in the Superfund program. There's less people exposed to toxic waste in this country today than there were in 1980. The water's cleaner and the air is cleaner. It's not clean, but it's cleaner. And that's because we figured out ways of applying technology to addressing these problems. The importance of finance and innovation and partnership is really going to be one of our themes. And we're going to also talk a bit about climate change and the sort of perennial issue between adaptation to the climate that is already changing and mitigation, which are the things we have to do to prevent things from getting worse and to eventually improve our situation. So I've talked enough. I'm going to sit down now and ask these folks some questions. I want to start by asking each of them to tell you a little bit about what they do professionally. And I'd like you to also highlight what's the single most important initiative that you're involved in right now that you think will have the biggest impact on sustainability. We'll start at that end with you, Adam, and we'll work our way down here.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. I'm always nervous after an introduction like this, though, to say anything and dissuade you guys from believing anything Steve said. But welcome, everyone, to the summer program here. You are an incredible institution at an incredible time, at a really important time for the work you're doing. So first and foremost, congratulations on that, and thank you, because as Steve was saying about being an optimist, we're making progress, but we're not going to get the job done before you graduate from your program. So we're going to need everyone here continuing to work on the effort. So what do I do on my day job? I work in an organization called Bloomberg Associates. We are a pro bono consulting firm, 100% free, part of Bloomberg Philanthropies. And we work with cities around the world. Our only mission is to improve the quality of life for the residents that live there. Typically work with the city for 3 to 5 years. I'm one of the principals there. I lead our sustainability practice, which is everything from deep decarbonization to climate adaptation to air quality, water quality, solid waste, to affordable housing. Because you can't be a sustainable city if people can't afford to live there from an equity and diversity perspective, but also because you're locking in emissions if people have to move farther and farther out from the city center for affordability, and they're going to be driving in and working on urban sprawl. So those are the issues that we work with. Cities around the world, so currently working in London, Bratislava, Lisbon, Newark, New Jersey, Phoenix, Tampa. We've worked in Latin America and other places throughout Europe, so a wide variety of cities. And Steve had alluded to work that I used to do within the region. Prior to that, I led a global water program at the Nature Conservancy, working around the world. And before that, when I first started teaching here at Columbia, I was leading the sustainability efforts for New York City when Mike Bloomberg was mayor. One of the most exciting things, and I think impactful things I'm working on now, we're working with the city of Phoenix to develop a shade plan. So it's a city that has over 130 days a year, over 110 degrees. I think they're approaching that right now. They start hitting 100 degrees usually in April, maybe early May. So major issues. They used to have a tree and shade master plan. We're helping them broaden that and think about built and natural shade side by side. And rather than having a citywide shade goal of 28% tree canopy coverage, we're thinking about how do you direct shade efforts to where people are outside the most with a focus on equity and vulnerable populations. So really reshaping their efforts, taking a data-driven approach, and I hope that will be a model for other cities to use around the world.
Thank you. Susanne.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. And welcome, everyone. Great to see some familiar faces in the audience. So I'm Susanne DesRoches, and I work at NYSERDA. And NYSERDA is basically the state's energy office, is sort of the easiest way to think of it. Much of the funding that we have to spend on clean energy transition activities comes through the utility bills, right? So if you look on your utility bill, you will see something called a systems benefit charge, and that goes into a pot of money that helps the state clean the grid. And what I do is focus on all types of buildings. There's 8 million buildings statewide, and they are the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So we spend a whole host of time figuring out everything from how do we build a workforce that does insulation and facade upgrades, all the way to what are the new types of products and technologies we need in order to do deep decarbonization in our buildings. I work with industry and agriculture. We did a really interesting project around energy efficiency in the cannabis industry. So we wrote the specs for that. So we had a couple of really
Were there a lot of field trips involved?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, not for me, but potentially for the staff. So, one really exciting thing that we're working on is we have a great partnership with NYCHA, which is the New York City Housing Authority. And we've done sort of a two-phased approach with them. They came to us and they said, we really want to upgrade this building. It has a really old heating system, and we want to upgrade it to window heat pumps. But we want to plug them into a regular outlet. Usually they have to be into a larger sized 220 outlet. So we did a challenge, and we went out to the industry and we said, we'll give you sort of the incremental cost for you to develop this product, because NYCHA in the end is going to use 30,000 of them. So we have a couple of them in production now. They're being tested. And that will really expand the world of how we can electrify heating, because if you can just stick the unit in your window like you do with an air conditioner today and plug it into a regular outlet, we can start to phase this in. And so people get used to using, the heat pump technology rather than their one pipe steam system like most of us have here in New York City. And we've expanded that to induction stoves. So we said, okay, this is going great with the heat pumps. Let's do a regular, full range. It'll be electric induction, and again, plug into a regular plug. So, talking about partnerships, there's great partnerships within sort of the manufacturing, private industry. We're here to catalyze these types of activities with our incentive dollars. And NYCHA, who is, always looking to innovate, but doesn't have the capital to do so.
What's interesting about your NYCHA story is it reminds me a little of, Lloyd Cass, who Lloyd teaches for us and ran energy efficiency at NYCHA for 8 years. And one of the things that one of their projects was to replace their refrigerators in the apartments. And they had to be a certain size because they had to fit in a certain place. Mm-hmm. And they were old refrigerators, so they were smaller than modern ones. And so he did something similar to what you were just describing, getting bids on manufacturers to make refrigerators specially for NYCHA. And they have 400,000 people living in those apartments, so I guess it's a big enough market to bid on.
It's a pretty big market.
Okay. Curtis.
So I have to follow the refrigerator story. So welcome, everyone. It's good to see some friends in the audience, some former students. And if you're a guest from the community, welcome to Columbia. So my name is Curtis Probst, and I'm the president and CEO of NYSERDA, New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation. We are a green bank, and you might say, well, what is a green bank? There are approximately 40 green banks nationally, and there are many green banks across the world. And green banks are either public agencies or not-for-profit organizations that exist to fill gaps in the financing of the clean energy transition. So at NYSERDA, we were formed actually with Recovery Act monies during the Bloomberg administration. And since then, we have been operating throughout New York City and have expanded actually to work in New York State. We work very closely with NYSERDA, and we finance projects throughout the region. Most recently in District of Columbia, Montgomery County, Maryland, but we've done things from basically Boston to Washington. So why do green banks exist? Because there are financing gaps. If you have a $500 million renewable energy project to finance, you can have a half dozen bankers land on your doorstep within an hour with proposals on how to do that. But if you're financing and you're looking for $1 million loan to finance deep energy retrofit at a homeless shelter in New York City, you're not going to get large banks interested in that. If you're working with a newer technology, let's say battery storage, at NYSERDA we financed the first battery storage application in multifamily affordable housing. Newer technology, it doesn't have the track record. Working with newer contractors, particularly minority and women-owned business contractors, they may not have the track record to go into your typical commercial bank, FDIC regulated institution and get a loan, but we can provide those loans. So our largest sector is multifamily affordable. 60% of our loans have been supporting that sector, and it's been community solar, storage, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, building energy efficiency, high performance buildings, net zero, passive house, you name it. And we've worked 85% in or supporting low to moderate income communities. So the kinds of buildings, in addition to affordable multifamily, we've done community centers, faith-based institutions, assisted living, supportive housing, community health facilities, schools, and other institutions. So that gives you a sense of kind of who we are, what we do. Most of you have probably heard the term P3, which is a public-private partnership. We want to be a little cooler than that. So we're a P4, which is a public-private philanthropic partnership, which reflects where our capital comes from. We are an amalgam of capital from the private sector, the public sector, and philanthropic sources. That gives us an incredibly low cost of capital to do these really hard transactions, to jumpstart the market and see then eventually the private sector comes in and does these loans and we move on to the next hard thing. So hopefully that again, gives you a sense of what we do. As far as things that most excited about, proud, we have so many different programs with the city, with the state, with other green banks, but very excited about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is a program within the Inflation Reduction Act. We may talk about that more in this program, but that's probably the most exciting opportunity where the federal government is putting out $27 billion to help finance the clean energy transition in a just and equitable way, and hopes to mobilize many times more of that in private sector capital.
That may be a good place for us to start this discussion of public-private partnership, because I think, I mean, the reason why public-private partnership is important is that what motivates most things in this world is the profit motive. And in the corporate sense, that's profit, it's return on equity, it's market share. Those are the goals of private corporations. So how do we line up public purposes with the profit motive, let's say, to summarize all three? And what have you seen really work in your time in this field so far? And what do you think are good examples of getting companies into this and then companies becoming successful, making money because of it? So I'll throw that out to anybody who wants to start us on that. Susanne,
I'm happy to start. Since Adam started with the first question, we'll move down the row. So we run a program called the Empire Building Challenge. And the point of the program is to get large New York State real estate owners that have huge portfolios to commit to being carbon neutral by 2050. I almost said 2025, which would be amazing, but wrong year.
Go Susanne.
Yeah, I just upped it by 25 years. So they sign up as part of what we call a cohort, right? And so we have 16 of these real estate owners that currently have committed to carbon neutrality, one of which is the Empire State Building. Empire Realty. And what we support them with is putting together that decarbonization plan. Most of the buildings that they own are relatively large, so they really have to do it in a phased way, right? They can't come in, unless they're doing a gut reno, they can't come in and just replace everything. So using the Empire State Building as an example, we help them develop a plan that basically cut their carbon emissions by 80% over 7 years with a 10-year payback. That's really impressive. And they are, they're working their way through that plan, but they're kind of a poster child. And what we do with that information, and coming probably next week, is a whole new online platform where we pull in all of the different building types that these owners have, all of their plans, what they've done to date. We publish that information very transparently in order to get other building owners to do the same. We get a lot of interest in this. We also have a prize that goes along with it. So that brings in the manufacturers. So we're doing an Empire Tech Prize where we said, okay, we have these huge buildings. They have these massive boilers. Give us technologies that can phase that decarbonization. We know that putting air source heat pumps on, a skyscraper is impossible, and we don't have the technology readily available in order to do these sort of as swap outs. So we're going out to the industry again with this cohort of all of these real estate owners to say, we've got all these people interested. What kind of technology can you develop and then scale?
That sounds great. Adam.
Yeah, maybe I'll pick an example that's on the other side of the spectrum. We are working in the city of London. The mayor there, unlike New York, has very limited powers. He controls their version of the MTA with the TfL, which on a day like today would be wonderful, because we'd still have congestion pricing. But they don't control building codes. They can't mandate, and you'll hear about, if you already haven't, Local Law 97 in New York, which mandates carbon reductions in buildings. We had something called the Greener Greater Buildings Plan when Mike was mayor that required retro-commissioning, upgrades to lighting and building envelopes. The mayor of London can't do that. And coming out of the pandemic, they said there's an acute energy issue that businesses are facing as energy prices in Europe are going up, and small businesses are coming out of the pandemic and feeling a lot of pain. And the city has a net zero goal by 2030 that they can't actually meet because they can't mandate that buildings reduce their carbon emissions. So we helped them create what they call the Mayor's Business Climate Challenge, and it was modeled after the Mayor's Carbon Challenge in New York, where we challenge businesses to reduce their energy use 10% in 1 year. They got a free audit to do that. They joined a cohort. We worked with local business improvement districts to kind of help attract them in, to mentor them, to create that cohort and learning spirit. Amongst them, we had 250 businesses that joined. Those businesses that had their energy audits for at least 9 months saw a 7.5% reduction in energy use. So they're on pace, we think, to get to that 10%. And they're saving money because energy rates have gone up given the war in Ukraine and other challenges on the global scale. And 97% of those businesses that have been in the program for a year said they plan on taking additional actions once that 1 year program ends. And we've now increased that, so we have another 250 businesses that have joined that. So this is really an incredible alignment. Even if we never mentioned climate change, even if we never said you're helping save the planet, we're saving the money. Their employees care and are happy to be there. They're finding they're attracting more customers. And by the way, we're putting them on a pathway to net zero. All those things are happening at the same time. So try to find those alignments. And I just say why public-private partnerships or public-private philanthropic partnerships, the P4, are so important, because the scale of the challenges that we need to face are too big for government to do alone. They're too big for companies to do on their own. They're too big for philanthropy, even with the money that we have to solve alone. We need to come together to do this and really leverage the unique attributes and characteristics that we have to do this, and we need to be doing it much faster.
Great points. Curtis.
So I'm going to pick up the theme of building decarbonization that Susanne was speaking about. So why doesn't everybody just do building decarbonization? Why isn't every new building in New York City, net zero energy, fully electrified? Someday it will be, but we're not there yet. And one of the reasons why is because it's harder. It requires more planning up front. Not every architect does this. Not every engineering firm does this. You have to order special equipment in some cases. Sometimes that equipment is hard to get domestically. There are a lot of challenges in doing this. But it's possible, but it requires more effort. So if you ask the typical real estate developer to do this, they have scarce capital and it's expensive. So are they going to put an additional $5 million up front to make a building net zero? Well, that $5 million is their equity. That has a very high return requirement associated with it. So they may just build according to code because you know what? They can still sell that building and all the rest. So what we do is we provide a pre-development loan product. And other green banks do this as well. So we provide a pre-development loan to finance, let's say, that $5 million of architectural, engineering, permitting work to allow the building to be built to a high performance standard, net zero, passive house, one of these building standards. What happens there is now the real estate developer doesn't have their equity tied up in this early stage funding work. They can do more buildings. They can do more green buildings and they can make them deeper. What happens from our perspective is we're financing this early stage work, and then when they eventually get a construction loan, our loan is repaid. We take that money, recycle it, and go find a new pre-development loan. If you look at our portfolio, 40% approximately of our loans are pre-development. We are allowing building owners to efficiently, cost-effectively do deep green building designs. As for the construction and permanent loan, we don't need to do that. There are lots of banks in New York City that will fund, $200 million, $400 million construction or permanent loan. But not so many banks are interested in doing a $2 million, $4 million, $8 million loan that's short term. You don't get rich as a bank making really short term loans that are really small. But we're a not-for-profit, so it's okay. We can do that because we have a broader mission that we're trying to serve, and then we can mobilize the private sector capital. On one project in Brooklyn, New York, we provided a $7 million pre-development loan. We syndicated it to other mission-driven lenders, and it enabled a $380 million net zero building project, a project that could otherwise have been built according to code and would not have had all the clean energy attributes. So that's an example of how we try to unlock the private sector capital and support a cleaner and more just energy economy.
So our field is changing, it's evolving. This field of sustainability, environmental protection, when I started in it, it was all about regulation and telling the private sector what the standards were and trying to understand the health impacts. And now as it's evolving, it has more planning, more thinking, and more innovation, and of course this relationship with the private sector. So I'd like each of you to tell me what you've seen as changed since you first got engaged in this field and what you see happening over the next 5 or 10 years. I could tell you my ideas, but I actually want to hear what you guys have to say. And Adam, we'll start with you and work our way down again.
Sure. I think one of the things I've seen change is the focus on adaptation and a recognition that it's not, I think back to 2009, I think it was, they had the climate conference of the parties was in Copenhagen. And Mike was chair of C40, an organization of, at that point, it was 40 of the largest cities taking on climate change around the world. They've kept the name, it's now over 100 cities. And we tried to have mayors go to the Conference of the Presidents to talk at COP about climate. We were shut out. We had to actually have our own summit at City Hall in the middle of the square, and we helped do the planning for that. And there was a huge debate, do we include climate adaptation as a topic or not? Is it admitting defeat if we talk about adaptation, take the eye off the ball on mitigation? I fought very hard to ensure that we did do adaptation. It was the last session at that summit. And I think now you flip forward 15 years later, a lot of the talk is about adaptation. It's on equal footing. Yes, we need to mitigate. We need to reduce, as Steve was saying, that's going to make the bad stuff much less bad. But adaptation is not an option. And I think there's an evolution. Is it adaptation? Is it resilience? What do we call it? But there is now, equal sides of the same coin. And I think they should be kept together and thinking about how do you make sure that you're taking advantage of things as you're decarbonizing. To do adaptation, battery storage, solar, energy resilience, and on the flip side, when you're doing resilience, not locking in more emissions than you otherwise could, given the finite resources, time, and effort to do things. But I think that's been a huge evolution, that it's not climate change in the future. It is here and now, when we look at the weather that's happening, the impacts that are happening, and I think there's a greater recognition of that, and maybe even more of a motivator to get people to take action.
Thanks, Adam. Suzanne.
So along the same lines, when I left SEPA in 2008, it was a pretty terrible recession at that time. And I went to work for the Port Authority as their first sustainable design manager. I didn't really know what that meant at the time. So don't be afraid when you graduate to just like leap into something. But really what it meant was I had to convince about 400 engineers and architects that they should care about climate at all. It took me probably 2 years to get anybody's attention. I stayed for 7. But halfway through my tenure there, Hurricane Sandy happened. And I got a call from the chief engineer and he said, you know, you were talking about flooding. Like, yes, I have been talking about flooding. He was like, I want you to run the post-Sandy rebuilding effort for the Port Authority. And I was like, okay, another one of those moments of like, well, I don't know what that means, but exciting. And over the course of the time doing that work, I convinced the authority to use climate projections in all of their designs. So it's a real passion of mine. I then went to New York City, did the same thing, wrote the climate resiliency design guidelines, and saw that, as Adam was saying, like the decision wasn't about are we, mitigating greenhouse gases or are we making things more resilient? It was like, how do we put in processes that ensure that this will happen every time we spend $1? And I would say one of my proudest moments, although it was over Zoom because it was height of the pandemic, was when City Council passed a law that said you must use these design guidelines for all city capitals. So now, instead of, shockingly, everything else that gets built, which uses historical weather data, by the way, New York City's capital plan uses forward-looking climate data. So started that work now at the state. We're very nascent days of how do we do that across such a large portfolio. But, we are seeing, instead of it being like, oh, I'm going to build a LEED platinum building over here, it's like, how do we change business as usual in order to be lower carbon, more resilient? And what are the processes actually, because I get really in the weeds about codes and other kinds of standards that we, have an entire country built on. How do we lift all of that up rather than pick and choose those individual projects? So that's what I've seen happen, that I think also, going back to your earlier statement, like we have the tools, we can do it, we just have to figure out those ways. And for me, that kind of process change is really important.
Kurt?
Yeah, I think there's been a tremendous amount of innovation in the last number of years. It used to be the case that there's always a lot of innovation in the private sector. And then you had the public sector was largely in a modality of providing incentives, in addition to all the other things that the public sector does. But as far as this world, financing the just and equitable clean energy transition, largely providing incentives. And philanthropy was largely providing grants. That was kind of the landscape. It wasn't overly creative. And now we have a lot of, borrowing, partnering, different instruments. So I'll give you a couple of examples. We've worked closely with the Kresge Foundation, and they are a grant-making institution, but they also provide guarantees. And that's fairly efficient from their perspective, because if they provide a grant, that money goes out the door. If they provide a guarantee and that guarantee is never called upon, they don't use any capital, and then they can provide another guarantee. So it gives them some leverage. So we secured a guarantee from the Kresge Foundation to do work in low to moderate income communities around solar plus storage and later building decarbonization. $3 million grant. That $3 million grant allowed us to make $8 million of loans, because they weren't guaranteeing 100%, because then that takes away, our incentive to underwrite good loans. And the $8 million of loans turned into $78 million worth of projects. So 26 times multiplier between the size of the guarantee and the amount of project capital deployed. We've yet to call on the guarantee. In fact, we actually pay a small fee for the for the right to have the guarantee. But that's an example of using a private sector technology, one that insurance companies and banks through letters of credit have used for decades, that's now being deployed by philanthropy. In the public sector, you have lots of examples of innovation: green bonds, green banks. You have Local Law 97, which is a very innovative way. Levying charges per se isn't innovative, but the way it encourages behavior within the city of New York and provides an economic rationale for buildings to decarbonize is really important, and has served as a model for similar laws in other cities around the United States. So just a lot of innovation, a lot of borrowing of technologies, tools, processes. I think it's an exciting time, and for those of you who are students, just a great time to be studying sustainability, because you're seeing this really, tremendous amount of innovation and and creativity in the sector.
The creativity is really wonderful. And what's interesting from where I sit is, one of the problems with climate change when it first emerged as a problem is, unlike other environmental problems which you could see and touch, it was created everywhere, and its impact, oh my God, was in the future. And where toxic waste was here, and water pollution was here, and air pollution you could see and smell. And of course now those models from 2000 are all coming true. So climate now has become a real issue that people see. You watch the nightly news. I know most young people don't do that, but you watch the nightly news, and the first story every night is which part of the country is getting hit by the tornadoes and the hurricanes and the forest fires. And I think what that's done is it's changed the culture of the society and and we're seeing that in these organizations. And I'd like each of you to talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the sort of general change in culture and in people's, like when you got at the Port Authority and every engineer was resisting, saying, what is this stuff?
Yep.
Until Sandy indicated that they had a problem. And when I first started working in environmental protection, it was a fringe issue. I remember telling my father I was going to work for EPA, and he said, "Oh, that's cute. What are you going to do for a living?" And it's gone from the fringes to the center, and I think that plus this incredible creativity that you've all been talking about are the sort of cultural changes which makes this more than politics. That this is no longer a question of, can we get the right public policies? It's that businesses are actually seeing these as opportunities, and people within organizations are demanding it. So I'd like each of you to think on that and sort of, are you seeing that? Am I making this up? Or are we seeing this cultural shift going on? Susanne, why don't we start with you, since you haven't started yet?
Sure. So I think you're absolutely right, and I think that the shift in the climate, I like to say, the future weather we were promised is here, right? So I do think that has an impact on how people see, what the long-term viability is going to be of where they live, of where their family is. And I also think that there's just been so much more awareness in general. And we do a lot of sort of market testing of messaging. We see that we have some work to do around, like, fossil fuels are causing this issue. There's still, a fair amount of folks that may or may not believe that. I think there's reasons why. But I think on the adaptation side, what's helpful there is that because people are starting to really see that affect them personally, they're more willing to open up that conversation. I also think that, a number of states have passed some pretty incredible laws. New York State passed the Climate Act. It's one of the most aggressive climate laws in the country. We have both New York City and New York State having zero emissions new construction. It hasn't kicked in for the state yet, but New York City, no buildings can be built with fossil fuel starting this year, and then larger buildings in a few years. So, we've seen the popular support for some pretty aggressive actions. again, it's bumpy, right? As you said, like the clean energy transition, there's fits and starts. But I do think that groundswell has started. And I also think that, there's a lot of activism that has helped move some of these policies forward.
Okay. Adam, your reflections on this?
Yeah, I think I'll approach this as a optimist and a realist. When I started in 2008, which is actually when we got to meet when you were at the Port Authority and we were doing adaptation work together.
Yep.
I knew every sustainability director, not just in the US, but in the world, because there were like a dozen of us, maybe 24 by the time I left the mayor's office.
And here we still are.
And here we still are. But there were only a few city sustainability directors. There were a couple companies that had CSOs in a major platform, and there were a couple plans that were out there. I think the shift and the change on the optimistic side is it's not a question if a city's going to have a sustainability plan and a sustainability office. Yes, they are. And it's, they're going to have goals. They're going to say we're net zero by 2050, 2030. You can debate about where it is, but most major cities have a sustainability office, have a climate office. Most companies have that. Yeah. I think the pragmatist side of it is I still don't think many people, senior leadership, mayors, CEOs, realize what it takes to meet them. And when you say, okay, you want to be net zero by 2030, that means no new buildings can be built with fossil fuels. That means you have to decarbonize every building that's out there, particularly heating sources. You need to decarbonize your energy supply because you're electrifying everything and you need a clean grid. You need to get rid of fossil fuel vehicles. You need to densify, and we still need to do energy efficiency to be able to get everything on the grid that we didn't really achieve from the 70s. And that comes with a big dollar tag and price tag with it. And I really think most mayors and leaders, when you look at that, don't appreciate what it takes to do that. So I think where we still need to make up for it is realizing the amount of money it's going to take, the amount of political will, and I think the congestion pricing, even when we get laws passed, sticking with them is really important and a real challenge. And then the persistence. It took us, 100 years to get where we are with climate change. We're not going to solve it in one mayoral term. We're not going to solve it in 1 or 2 years for corporate America or wherever the corporations are. We need that long planning horizon. We need to have the persistence to be able to do it. And I think that's where we still need more of a shift in the culture to happen.
Curtis, your reflection?
So a couple of things. I guess as it relates to awareness of climate change, there is greater awareness. There's no doubt about that. People see wherever you are in the country, whether it's flooding, it's wildfires, it's hail damage, it's, you can't see across the street because of smoke from Canada. Whatever the issue is, this is becoming front and center for a lot of people. So there is greater awareness of climate change. It's not some sort of ethereal, abstract discussion about parts per million in the atmosphere. Like, you can see stuff happening. So that's part of it. Then for people who still don't believe, to some degree, it's starting to matter less because this is just starting to make economic sense. And dollars and cents are what drive people's decision-making to a very large degree. So for example, the great state of Texas, #1 in wind of states in the United States, #2 in solar. There are people who are very environmentally sensitive in Texas, as there are in every part of the country. But a lot of it is it just makes economic sense. It's a better alternative. If you think about high performance buildings, we're all like environmental energy nerds up here, and we're like, oh, cool, like it's, reducing your bills by 80% or whatever. But these buildings are nicer buildings. They're more comfortable. They're quieter. We're financing a passive house uptown, even uptown from here. And you walk inside and it's like pin drop quiet. And you're like, wow, why aren't all buildings built like this? Like in New York City, you don't see that. And when the building was being constructed in the dead of winter, before any heating was working in the building, all of our workers were working in their t-shirts because the building is, so thermally efficient that it's just a better design. So people are getting more aware of climate change, but to some degree it's mattering less. because it's just a better way of doing business to do things sustainably, whether it's the energy system or it's buildings or electric vehicles are getting better and better. We're not talking about the Nissan Leaf with a 65-mile range anymore. We're talking about vehicles with over 300-mile ranges. So, people are making the switch. Maybe they're progressive. Maybe they care deeply about climate change. Maybe they just want a vehicle that they think is better for their needs. So anyway, those are my thoughts.
So let me explain something about our format here. So for the next 10 minutes or so, we'll take questions from the audience. There'll be a microphone that will come to you if you raise your hand. And then at 6:30, we're going into a room down the hall where we will eat and drink together and chat with some of our speakers and with each other. So do we have any questions for our panelists? Okay, can we get a mic up here? I see a question at the front. And please, a question, not a speech.
Hi. Sorry, I gotta check this.
You're good.
I'm Bella Montero. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for being here to educate us. All of you guys have brought up good points. There's one specific that caught my attention. Starting from energy, building, flooding, air climates, so on. The one that caught my attention, Port Authority, transit. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is that between New Jersey and New York?
Yep.
Okay, by GW.
So the Port Authority runs all the facilities across the Hudson River. So that's Goethals Bridge, it's Bayonne Bridge, all of those, as well as the airports, Path Train, World Trade Center. They have a whole host of assets.
Thank you. Are you still there now?
I am not.
Okay, you're not. So are you aware of, what goes on, currently when it comes to flooding in the Hudson River, especially during spring storm? Is there a plan for that? Are you aware of that?
So I think I need to talk a little more in depth. That's a very broad question.
Okay. So example.
Well, let's try to, we want to have other people ask questions. So ask the specific questions so we can get to other folks.
Sure. Example. Last year, we had a large flood. And I would say Port Authority area. Economy was high when it comes to cost. I'm trying to understand what is the plan for that to make sure that in the near future, there's a plan where we're not missing work or...
So you're asking a very complicated question. There are a number of different, and I'll try to give a succinct answer so we can make sure we get to other folks. But so if we look across, let's just stick with transit. We look across transit agencies. So MTA, the PATH system, and some of the New York City and New York State DOTs, so Department of Transportation. There are a number of different plans. There's also a federal plan, that's the Army Corps, that has looked at the entire Northeast and down to, I want to say, Maryland, to look at how to do flood protection. So I think we could connect afterwards and we could talk about a specific area because it's a very broad question. You're welcome.
Other questions? Okay, over here. There's two guys right in a row, so we'll take both of those.
Hello, thank you so much. I guess my question is more so about the new City of Yes housing and the new developments. We know New York is moving into a pro-development future, and I guess I'm curious about how the sustainable futures are gonna, be encumbrance of all of that development.
If I can jump in, because the interesting thing people don't necessarily realize about Plan YC, that was the first sustainability plan for the city. It was predicated and it started not because Mike Bloomberg was an environmentalist. It was because he got a population projection that New York City was going to grow by 1 million people by 2030. And he said, how do we accommodate that growth and do so in a sustainable way? where are we going? It started as a land use question. Where are we going to put those people if they're coming? And it turned out that most of our available land was waterfront land. And he said, well, they're all brownfields. So now, Plan YC, the first chapter was a housing chapter. The second was a brownfields chapter. And they said, but those areas flood and we have other issues. So now we need to think about water quality as well. And if we're adding that, they have to get around. Where are we going to do transit and how do we enhance that? And what do we need for power needs? So, the good news is that if you're living in New York, you're a climate champion. Your carbon footprint is 1/3 that of an average person in the US. We need more people to go to cities for the density. It's why transit systems should work. It's why, we have really small apartments that can be efficient because we share walls for heating and for noise and everything else that comes with it. But there are benefits of being in a city that we need more people to live in cities and continue to do that to conserve land and the resources. What we have to do, though, is we have to also invest in our infrastructure at the same time and make sure we're upgrading that. We have 1 million more people in New York. That's 1 million more people, hopefully, on transit. We need to upgrade our transit system. That means there's 1 million more people flushing toilets. We need to increase the capacity of our sewer system. It means that we're going to lose some green spaces. We need to make sure that we have stormwater capacity to offset that. For every inch of rain in the city, it's 1 billion gallons of stormwater we need to manage that compounds the flooding issues you were talking about. So, I'm a proponent of growth. I'm a proponent of density, but it has to be smart. It has to be thoughtful. And I think as we're doing that, and one thing that we didn't come up with that I want to make sure we touch on, we have to be intentional about where we're doing that. We've done a lot of damage in our cities. The impacts that we're feeling from heat, from flooding, it's actually by design. It's not by accident that cities are overheating, that they're flooding. It's because we built our cities in a way that did not account for the climate risks. And with redlining and many of the systemic, institutional, racist, and discriminatory policies, there are populations that are disproportionately impacted by that. New growth and investments offer a huge opportunity and an obligation, I think, to reverse that. So I'm excited for the possibility, but it will not happen if we're not being intentional.
Okay. Question from the person in front.
Thank you. It was a good question and a good answer. Regarding NYSERDA's incentives that facilitate, a lot of green initiatives, how effective have those programs been in helping the private sector actually facilitate, say, investments like solar arrays where feasible and charging station infrastructure? And can we expect those investments in the future?
Yeah, so I'll take the last question first. So yes, you can expect those investments to continue. As I talked about earlier, there is a pot of money that comes from the utility rate base that goes to clean energy, investments across the state. So if we talk about solar has been incredibly successful. We've just passed the 6 gigawatt goal that we had set for 2025, and then we increased the goal to 10 gigawatts across the state. That program has been incredibly successful. Again, I would say that going back to what you were talking about, it makes economic sense. People make money on solar, so it's really done quite well. For my work, for the energy efficiency and decarbonization work, there's a whole range of incentives and how you measure success, right? So if we're talking about a low income person living in a disadvantaged community, we are going to lean into more of 100% subsidy for weatherization, upgrades to the facade, insulation, possibly windows, et cetera, to modernize that home to get it ready to be electrified. If we are talking about skyscrapers, on the other hand, we're taking very small incentive dollars and we're stretching them as far as they'll go so that market, those folks that own those buildings will start to use that incentive money to grow the business further and further and further. So it depends on what part of the sector you're looking at as to how you describe success. We measure number of jobs that are created. We measure energy efficiency gains, right? We measure operational profits. We measure all kinds of different metrics depending on where the incentive has gone.
So I want to do something that I always like to do in panels. We're going to conclude with our panelists each coming up with something that they wish that we'd gotten to tonight that they wanted to articulate to this audience, and that'll be our conclusion before we go and eat and drink. So, Curtis, what did we not get to that we should have?
Sure. Well, be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about the role of education in all of this, considering we're sitting here at Columbia University. This is an incredible opportunity. We need to relearn a lot of what we have learned, and that's as consumers, that's as professionals, and that's whether you're an engineer, an architect, a financier, a media person, you name it. We need to think about things very differently. So I think there's a critical role for education in all of this. Sometimes we forget about that. We're focused on finance and policy, technology. That's all really, really important. But education is really important at all levels. Community education, higher education, K-12. So I just wanted to mention that point, and I will yield the floor to Susanne.
Yeah, on a similar note, how we talk about the work that we're doing, I think is critically important. So I've used the word decarbonization in this audience, but I won't use it in other audiences because it can set up kind of a barrier, right? So how we talk about it, I often will say that we are just modernizing our buildings, right? That's what we're doing.
It sounds like what happens to seltzer water when you leave it open.
Yeah, it decarbonizes. Exactly. So, I do think that words really matter, language matters, and accessibility to information matters, and how we talk about it. And, frankly, a lot of folks that have been in this world, we tend to be technical people, right? We tend to want to get into the substance and understand the whole thing. And at the end of the day, all we're trying to do is modernize our buildings, right? So I have to get back to that place, and so that it becomes less scary. I don't want to talk about carbon footprint. That was made up by the oil and gas industry in order to make us feel bad, right? Feel guilty about your own behavior. I don't think that that's a useful way to message that we need to take a big leap forward and we need to get ready for what's coming, as well as make sure that we're using our resources efficiently and that they're clean, right? There's very simple ways to talk about this. And I think that part of it sometimes gets a little bit muddled when we get too far into the weeds.
Okay, Adam.
I think the big challenge that we have is scale. We've talked about and given a lot of examples. We could spend another hour talking about pilots or programs and the types of solutions. We know what the solutions are that are necessary. The challenge is how to get them done at a scale and a pace that will help avert what's happening. Now, I think we're all in the business of the future here, and that future has to be hopeful. So I'm optimistic we will. But the status quo and the way we've been doing things is what's gotten us here. And we need to figure out ways to break that, new processes, new approaches to scale up the pace of the change that's happening. And I think we can't talk about that enough.
Okay, thank you. Well, please join me in thanking the panelists.